I threatened a lot of men professionally. In the sort of career I've had, I've met a lot of forceful men, particularly at the World Bank, and nobody asked them to moderate. And why should I moderate myself in being forceful? On the contrary, quite often you have to be more forceful than a man to be recognised. I was brought up in a small town in Czechoslovakia, about 2 or 3 hours journey from Prague. There's no translation for it, called Česká Třebová. My father managed a textile factory, and my mother, who'd worked till she was married, was a housewife. My father was 40 when he married, rather late. My mother was 14 years younger than he was. And she came into this big house where my father, as a bachelor, had lived in one room with a grumpy housekeeper. And, of course, as a married couple, they furnished the house. The house went with the factory, with the job. I had an excellent relationship with my father. My parents decided not to have any more children, partly because my mother had difficulty having me, and partly because they didn't think it was a good idea to bring a Jewish child into the world in the late 20s, early 30s. So my father didn't know how to talk to children, so he talked to me as an adult, and that was great. And seeing he had a daughter, he wasn't in any way at all a male chauvinist, so I had a wonderful time as a child. I also had a very good relationship with my mother, although until much later I didn't really appreciate her because it was my father who took part in politics, who played chess by telephone all over Czechoslovakia, who had serious friends, and my mother was more frivolous. But although I suppose my education in music and art came more from my mother than my father.
What sort of education did your father give you?
Well, mainly in politics and social science, natural science. I remember when I was very young, about 3 or so, we went off in a horse-drawn sleigh to go skiing. And the horses propped at something and we all fell back in the sleigh. And my father explained to me what happened. I mean, he explained Newton's laws of motion to me. And I thought that was terrific.
Were your parents very politically aware?
My father was very political, took part in political life, marched on the 28th of October, the Czech National Day, in his old uniform, which had to be let out over the years. He had been in the Austro-Hungarian army and crossed the line in Italy to become a Czech legionnaire, and so he was very active politically right through the 20s and the 30s.
As a patriot, where was he positioned on the political spectrum?
Well, he was in the centre, a social democrat, a patriot, and he didn't want to leave Czechoslovakia in the 1930s. He wanted to fight the Germans.
Now, you were growing up in Czechoslovakia, close to the German border. Were you conscious of your Jewishness?
Well, my parents weren't conscious of their Jewishness until Hitler came along. They had been married in a registry office and they were agnostics, and so no, nobody was conscious of being Jewish. I'd never been to a synagogue. But when fascism arose at the end of the 20s and then particularly in the early 30s, my parents became conscious of the fact that they were Jews. They, of course, wouldn't dream of hiding it. So they started to find out about what being Jewish meant. And they decided to teach me what being Jewish meant. I listened to the radio on Kristallnacht, which was in the late 30s, and I heard it all on the radio, what was happening. And I became very frightened, naturally. Any sensible person did. And people started to talk about concentration camps because not only Jewish people, politicals were being sent to concentration camps. So in my father's very democratic circles, that became an issue. And then more and more Jewish people started to flee Germany and Austria, come to Czechoslovakia, and talk about concentration camps. The Russians, the French, and the English promised to come to Czechoslovakia's aid if it was attacked by Hitler. And I suppose my father half believed that. My mother thought that was totally impractical. And she started to look for a place where we could emigrate. As you probably know, it was very difficult. A period of high unemployment all over the world. And nobody wanted a Jewish problem, I suppose. So it was quite difficult to emigrate. But my mother knew the chap who was the Czech consul, you know, people who give out visas in Melbourne, because he was a Rotary friend of my father's. And she persuaded my father to write to him to see if we could emigrate to Australia. And Australian Rotarians sponsored our immigration, so that it was my mother who got us the visa to get out. We messed about until it was clear that the Germans were going to march into Prague, into Czechoslovakia. And we even tried to get away then and went to Prague. So I actually saw and stayed in a hotel, the centre of Prague, and I actually saw the German army march into Czechoslovakia.
With your own eyes?
With my own eyes, from behind a Venetian blind. Well, in those last few months in Czechoslovakia, very bad things started to happen. One of my aunts was married to an Austrian social democrat who'd become a banker, quite a well-known guy, and he went to Germany for some reason or other. And to cut a very long story short, he was, well, that's a stupid way of putting it. He was beaten to death by the Germans in an interrogation. And I knew about that. You know, nobody told me about it, but I knew about it. And I suppose my last few months in Czechoslovakia, I was very, very frightened. That's partly reflecting the fears of my parents, but, you know, any sensible person, any sensible Jewish person was very, very frightened. So my parents then decided they had to get out. And the traveller's checks and the lift van and, you know, whether the new suit was made, stopped being important. They cashed all their savings in currency, and they had heard that there was an SS guy operating in the toilets of a leading Prague hotel, giving out exit visas. And what was stopping us now was we couldn't get an exit visa. So they bribed him. And the next day, we were on a train out of Prague via Germany to Holland. So we were on the train, but we didn't know whether our visa was a genuine visa or whether it was a joke by this particular SS officer and that we'd be pulled off the train and sent to concentration camp. And, you know, my best moment in my entire life was going into Holland because we knew we were out.
How important was it to you as a young Czech refugee girl to become Australian?
Desperately important, desperately important. I wanted to disappear into the crowd, and I worked very hard at it. I played sport, and I gradually, you know, really got into it. I belonged to a Saturday morning tennis club which was great. Just ordinary Australian kids, and we all played tennis. And then a group of us became friends, and we started to go swimming together in the summer and go on blueberrying in the winter and ride our bikes down to Frankston and all those things that are typical. And I became very Australian. But at the same time, my parents, my father particularly, really, you know, my parents' total attention was to the war in Europe. And during the first year, as you know, what was called the phony war, and nothing much was happening except all their relatives were being rounded up. And my grandparents committed suicide in Prague, which was very, very sensible. We didn't find that out, I think, until after the war, from their maid. My grandfather was a very clever man, lawyer, and they committed suicide rather than go to concentration camp. I mean, what a sensible decision. You know, one of my aunts was so upset, she doesn't believe it. My parents would have assumed that no matter where they were, there was a culture, and they wanted to be plugged into it. They went to concerts. I mean, no culture in Australia. This is all nonsense. Who can forget the creaking chairs of the Melbourne Town Hall in the symphony orchestra? So my parents got a subscription to the symphony orchestra. It's where your priorities were. A lot of their friends send their kids to private school, but my parents got symphony orchestra tickets, and we went to the symphony, and you met among the refos, the people who were interested in that sort of thing, and you began to meet Australians.
Now, at school, you decided to study economics. Why was that?
It was more analytical and so much more intellectually challenging, particularly to somebody who was weak in maths as I was. My maths didn't catch up till years later. And it was socially meaningful. When I went to Melbourne University, I was strongly advised to do an honours degree in history because it was in history I'd got my best marks. And literature, I'd got my best marks, or English, whatever it was called. And I decided to stick with economics. My boyfriend of the time, whom I married, I mean, you know, main boyfriend whom I married, Helen Hughes, was not a university person, he was a journalist. And we had a pretty good life at the university. We lived together before we were married.
During this time, while you were at university, you were very drawn towards the left of politics. How far left were your politics?
I was a member of the Communist Party for a year or so, till I was thrown out for being a bourgeois element. I wasn't a very good communist. But I was still left enough to go to the World Youth Festival in East Berlin in 1951. And after that, my husband, Helen Hughes, got a trip to China, one of the first Australians to go to China. And I got a trip to Poland, and then I went to Romania. So I started to look at what Eastern Europe was like. Never went back to Czechoslovakia. Tried once and had difficulty getting a visa because the Czech communists didn't want any sort of leftovers like me around, I suppose. Never tried again. And then I had a fantastic 2 years at the London School of Economics, using it as a club, going to interesting seminars, travelling around Europe, reading, going to the theatre, going to every political meeting in sight. Having done that for 2 years, I decided I was there to write a PhD. I moved out of the London School of Economics to the British Museum, where I used to sit in a different seat every day, thinking I might be sitting in Marx's seat today. You know, he did his work there. And I wrote a PhD thesis in a little over a year, submitted it, got it, came back to Australia. Well, I couldn't get a job, even as a tutor, because although my qualifications were okay, I was a married woman who was, for the next 2 or 3 years, either pregnant or feeding a child or expecting another child. So it was very difficult in those days for a woman in my situation to get a job. It was still in Australia, married women had to resign from teaching or public service, and I don't know what the situation was in the universities, but I do know that they weren't hiring any. So I did market research for 4 years, but then, and I still thought, particularly bringing up children, that being an academic gives you the most freedom in being able to work the hours you want to work. So I applied for a job at the University of New South Wales. The head of the department, David Rowan, Professor David Rowan, was an Englishman, and he didn't understand about women being second-class citizens. Anyway, I got the job and had a very happy couple of years in University of New South Wales, working with David Rowan in that department and working with a lot of interesting people.
Did you find that men were sometimes intimidated by the fact that you were so bright?
Well, the fact that I was competing like a man, of course they were intimidated, because when my marriage broke up, I went to Queensland for promotion and to get away from, marriage breakup. And in Queensland, the men in the Department of Economics were all total male chauvinists. And at least once a day, somebody made a remark about, that it was a male, that women had no right to work.
In career terms, what would you see as the most productive and significant period of your life?
I was at the ANU for 5 years, and I started to work on industrialisation in Southeast Asia, particularly on Singapore. And I got deeply involved in Singapore issues. Singapore in 1965 got chucked out of the Malaysian Federation. The British were leaving and Indonesia had confrontasi. And it was a terrific working atmosphere in Singapore. Everything any analysis you did was taken very seriously, and if it made policy sense, it was acted on. It was actually quite frightening. I mean, this was 1963. I wasn't that old. I was in my 30s. And to be taken so seriously was really quite, you did lie awake at night wondering whether you were saying the right thing. And I started to work on developing country policy and to develop analysis and positions. And I did that for 5 years. And then I was due for a sabbatical. So for 5 years I worked on Southeast Asia, travelling around, making friends with a lot of people who were young university lecturers, young analysts. The work on Singapore culminated in a book about how to go about industrialisation. And because of that and my work, I was picked to do a job on industrialisation for the Asian Development Bank, one of its first analytical pieces. I was then due for a sabbatical, and Sir John Crawford suggested I take it at the World Bank because he said, you're at a research institute already, why don't you learn about policy? So I went to the World Bank, and on the way there, doing some lecturing in Bangkok, I met my second husband. So I went to the World Bank on sabbatical and then took the longest sabbatical anybody had ever had from the ANU. I was there for 15 years.
Who was your second husband?
Graham Dorrance. He was a staff member at the International Monetary Fund, and we were both teaching together in a development course in Bangkok, and we got to know each other.
You were offered a very senior job, a very important job at the bank.
Yes, it was a very job. It was the most senior job any Australian had held in the bank. I was one of the first of the World Bank's women managers, although from the early 70s we started to work on that. There are now many women managers. But I was the first division chief, woman division chief in the World Bank, and I was probably the first director, although I can't remember. So yes, it was a very senior job, very responsible job. It was a job we had to sign off. The bank in those days used to borrow 16 billion and lend that much money to developing countries every year. And I, in effect, had to sign off on the borrowing and the lending as in the Central Economics Department. We were responsible for world debt. You remember the 70s were the years of the debt crisis. World trade, this was the period when the Kennedy round was being implemented. So it was a fascinating job. That I had about 80 PhDs working for me, and I had 6 division chiefs who were so much smarter than I that it wasn't funny, you know, young, very lively guys, better trained because they had been trained later. And we started the World Development Reports, the World Development Indicators, which everybody uses. They're lousy figures, but there's nothing better. So we really worked. It was a fascinating time. The World Bank is actually a development fund, and the International Monetary Fund is a central bank for the central banks of all countries. The idea was for the World Bank to borrow money in world markets at relatively low interest cost because it is an organisation guaranteed by 180 governments, and to lend it on to developing countries for major development projects. So that all the lending by the World Bank is on money that it has borrowed, and it is all to governments. And the governments always pay the World Bank first, because if they don't do that, they can't get any other money from the commercial banking system. But most of the World Bank's lending is for irrigation, education programs, industrial programs. They're for specific projects or programs.
When you finally returned to Australia, what policy issues did you get involved with here?
I did some further work on trade, on whether the export marketing development grants were a good idea, and I worked with people from trade unions and industry. And then I worked on immigration. Now, what sort of immigration program should we have? And that, of course, led into what sort of population policy should we have. Stephen Fitzgerald was the chair of that committee, the Fitzgerald Committee on Immigration. We felt that on the settlement side, there was a great danger of the fragmentation of Australian society, that Australia would become lots of little ethnic groups thinking more about their ties back to Greece or Croatia or wherever they had come from. And the Fitzgerald Committee was very strongly of the opinion that, yes, we wanted a multicultural society, but one that was essentially Australian, which had a language to unite it and a culture that was developing to unite it. I thought that was an excellent committee, and I thought it would be adopted, but the multicultural lobby sank it like a stone, so it was never heard from again. I still think that's what Australia should do.
How important is your family to you? What does it mean to you?
I'm totally irrational about my family, totally central to my life. You know, on a rational sort of plane, we're a very extended family because my former husband and his family are sort of, they're still my sisters-in-law, you know, we've never changed that. I have wonderful daughters-in-law, and I have 7 fantastic grandchildren.
What do you think the future is going to hold for your grandchildren?
Well, if people continue to work hard at technology and social relations and so on, I hope that they will live an even more interesting life than their parents or I have. And I think there's a fair chance that that'll happen.
Are you at all worried about the rise of the new fascists in Europe and the new right in America?
Very worried, particularly about the new fascists in Europe. And of course the world has a long history of stirring up trouble with minorities. The Jews are not the only minority that has suffered.
Could you imagine the right rising in Australia?
Yes, because, you know, I saw it rise in countries where people thought were very culturally advanced and We're very sophisticated, very well educated, and so on. And why not in Australia? What's so different about us? You know, liberty, democracy, fair go have to be fought for in every generation. You can never take it for granted.